Hello, everyone, and welcome to the second webinar of the Katharine A. Pearson Chair in Civil Society and Public Policy. My name is Daniel Weinstock. I'm a professor in the Faculty of Law and then the Department of Philosophy of McGill University, and I'm the holder of the Katharine A. Pearson Chair, which seeks to investigate the relationships between civil society organizations and the state. I took up the chair about a year and a half ago, and as I was starting to deploy the research agenda for it, the pandemic hit. And I realized that I had to rethink the ways in which the chair would consider its primary object. And so I decided to organize a series of webinars in which key actors of civil society, artists, religious leaders, members of community organizations, political parties, had to rethink their practices, had to rethink the way in which they related to their constituencies, to their publics, and had to rethink the way in which the future the way in which they might be led to change their practices in the future beyond the acute phase of the pandemic that we're currently still living through. So we're happy to welcome everyone in attendance. Today's webinar features three world-renowned artists who I will introduce in a moment. This being an event being held in Montreal, note that participants submitting questions in the Q&A are invited to write them in the language of their choice, as long as that language is either English or French, so that I can translate French questions as they arise. You should know that today's webinar is being recorded and will be made available for viewing on the YouTube platform and the Pearson Chair website. I will send you a link in the days to follow about how to access the recording. So as I said, we're pleased to welcome three distinguished guests today. I will introduce them before we get started with the discussion. Let me first welcome Jenny Holtzer to our webinar. For more than 40 years, she's presented her ideas, arguments, and sorrows in public places and international exhibits, including the Venice Biennale, the Guggenheim Museums in New York and Bilbao, the Whitney Museum of American Art, and the Louvre Abu Dhabi. Her medium, whether it's formulated as a t-shirt, a plaque, or an LED sign, is writing. And the public dimension is integral to the delivery of her work. Starting in the 1970s with the New York City posters and continuing through her recent light projections on landscape and architecture, her practice has rivaled ignorance and violence with humor, kindness, and courage. She's received the Leone d'Oro at the Venice Biennale in 1990, the World Economic Forum's Crystal Award in 1996, and the US State Department's International Medal of Arts in 2017. She holds honorary degrees from Williams College, the Rhode Island School of Design, the New School, and Smith College. She lives and works in New York. On a Montreal note, I should add that she was responsible for a very moving tribute to Leonard Cohen that was projected onto some of the granaries in the old city about a year after Leonard Cohen's death. Lily Kogelski is an award-winning photographer based in New York City. Her work has been published in Vogue, the New York Times, the New Yorker, the Huffington Post, Narratively, 13, Quartz, the Wilson Quarterly, Vice, and the Vera Institute of Justice. Her first book, Rockabye, was published in 2015 by Daylight Books, and her second book, I Refuse for the Devil to Take My Soul, was released by Powerhouse Books in 2019. She teaches photography at Manhattan College and New York University's Tisch School of the Arts. And Rafael Lozano-Hemmer was born in Mexico City in 1967. In 1989, he received a BSc in physical chemistry from Concordia University here in Montreal. He's a media artist working at the intersection of architecture and performance art. He creates platforms for public participation using technologies such as robotic lights, digital fountains, computerized surveillance, media walls, and telematic networks. Inspired by phantasmagoria, carnival, and animatronics, his light and shadow works are anti-monuments for alien agency. He was the first artist to represent Mexico at the Venice Biennale with the next exhibition at Palazzo Van Axel in 2007. He's received 2 BAFTA British Academy Awards for interactive art in London, a Golden Nika at the Prix Ars Electronica in Austria, Artist of the Year Rave Award from Wired Magazine, a Rockefeller Fellowship, the Trophée des Lumières in Lyon, an International Bauhaus Award in Dessau, and the title of Compagnon des Arts et des Lettres du Québec here in Quebec. So welcome to all three of you. And again, thank you so much for agreeing to take part in this conversation. So I'd like to begin by asking all three of you to project yourselves back imaginatively to whatever the date was in the places that you were, roughly, when the WHO announced that we were going through a pandemic. Different places proceeded in slightly different ways. Our premier here in Quebec went on public television and told us in a very solemn tone that Quebec was going to be taking a pause for a number of weeks and that everything would essentially be shutting down. The process was gone through in different ways at different places, but there was a moment, I think, where all of us felt that we were going to be experiencing a fairly unique moment in our lives. So I'd like you to project yourselves back to that moment and get your first thoughts, as you can recall them, about the ways in which you thought that this would modify the way in which you practice your art, the themes that you might be addressing, the challenges that would be faced in getting your art out to a public who, in conditions of crisis, perhaps needed it as much as ever before. And then perhaps reflect also on how your views, how your initial perceptions have changed with the benefit of hindsight. Were those initial projections roughly correct, or have you been surprised in the last year by the ways in which your practice has changed and evolved, both in terms of theme and in terms of support? So I'm going to ask all three of you perhaps to say some words as they arise about those two interrelated questions, proceeding alphabetically and starting, if you will, with Jenny Holtzer.
I recall Trump saying it was no big deal. I didn't believe him. About my own practice, first I was clinging to professional and private Trump loathing. And then I thought I might move from that to something potentially useful, applied art relative to get out the vote.
And now with the hindsight of a year, has the trajectory that you've been on for the last year or so, have there been any surprises? Have there been any changes relative to the way in which you projected things going in those first days?
I'm glad that I turned to what was potentially useful. I had tried sending trucks around with impeachment content that magically didn't work. So getting out the vote was better, I trust. Yeah, I'll leave it at that.
Okay. Lily?
Yeah, it was a strange moment for many reasons. I just had our second son 2.5 months before the pandemic started. So I was at home with a newborn baby. And, you know, there was this tension immediately between wanting to go out and document what was happening. You know, we were in New York City. Obviously, that was the epicenter of the pandemic. And wanting to hunker down and, you know, protect my family. And you know, I ended up doing work that I've never done before. I've always been out in the world and photographing other people and, you know, doing editorial work or journalism. But, you know, I turned the camera on my family for the first time, and I've been photographing my mother, which has been a rare treat. And, you know, on my own children. And it's not something I would have ever done otherwise. And that's been one of the happy outcomes of this very strange year.
Rafael, floor is yours.
So I got COVID early on in March in New York. I'm probably the one who brought it to Montreal, unfortunately. I was quite sick for a while, and it was very humbling, the fragility of the body and just the desire to survive it. Like Jenny, I was not trusting any of the politicians. You had Trump, but in Mexico, we have a very populist president who also does not believe the science or follow it, like we have here with Legault to an extent. And so the frustration, the disconnect between what the science was telling us and what the politicians were doing was very frustrating to be just observing it. I work in a team, so I have a studio team, and basically half of them left. everything changed. So I dropped caffeine. I started doing meditation and yoga. I did all the things that you're supposed to do. I got divorced. I tried everything. And you know, the honest truth is that to this moment, the studio has not recovered. We feel like COVID has really underscored a lot of the problems with this kind of globalized world we live in, right? There's this global pandemic, but on the other hand, for example, the vaccines are not globally available, right? The rich people are getting richer. The injustices are just getting a little bit more critical. And so when you're observing the way in which this is a very asymmetrical kind of phenomenon, I don't know, I think, you know, I was also trying to think, what can I do that is useful? How does an artist whose career is based on bringing people together, you know, deal with social distance? And so that's what we try to do.
So Rafael's last sentence is a perfect segue to the next question that I wanted to invite the three of you to reflect on in terms of your own practice. For a lot of us, our lives in the last 13 months have been reduced to spending more time in front of screens than we ever thought we would, than we ever thought possible. I'm a teacher, and you know, for me, the three-dimensional embodied classroom has disappeared and has become the two-dimensional Hollywood squares like sort of picture of my students' heads. Sometimes with the cameras on, sometimes just their names. Our entertainment very often is, you know, transforming the computer screen that we are looking at to work into the computer screen that we are looking at to watch movies or television series. We are spending, civil society to a large degree has been reduced to 2 dimensions for many of us. I'd like to ask all of you to reflect on the way in which this perhaps has changed your thoughts about how to make your art available, the challenges that this new reality that many of us are immersed in has posed for you. Does the fact that we are, that our conception of space and the way that we inhabit space has changed so radically had an effect on the way that you conceive of your practice? I won't name. I'll let people jump in as they see fit.
Should we hide? Okay, I'll give a short one. I'm still wed to screens. I love screens regardless. Where I've changed a bit is refocusing on what works on phones, because everyone still has his or her phone. Courtesy of the University of Chicago, we did a nice Get Out the Vote project with students who picked from text in their core curriculum what might potentially inspire people to go to the polls. And we presented that via augmented reality projections and on my go-to electronic trucks. So here's to screens.
Screens have made me think about accessibility, and in accessibility, especially, you know, I also teach, and, you know, suddenly you're in students' homes and they're in yours, and, you know, some of my students, you know, cannot get internet, and some are living in, you know, very small rooms with 3 siblings who are also trying to do remote learning, and, you know, the incredible disadvantage is so apparent. And, you know, higher education is becoming, you know, more inaccessible in a way. But, you know, I've also been thinking, you know, when it comes to art and media, we're so lucky that we have screens, so people can be seeing work and sharing work. And even if we can't be in person, you know, it's accessible to more people. You know, I think gallery spaces and museum spaces are at least perceived, or maybe are elitist and inaccessible. So I think having more screen time, having more access to these things in your homes is a positive, but, you know, double-edged sword.
Rafael, would you like to come in on this question?
No, we can move on to the next one.
Okay, great. Well, I'm afraid it's still going to be about space. So a lot of your work, I'm thinking of Rafael and Jenny, but also the subjects of some of Lily's photography are located in cityscapes in what are often densely populated public spaces, and sort of presuppose sort of high degree, I guess, of people sort of going through and having your work presented to them as they you know, as they interact with urban spaces that are their everyday settings. This is something that might be different from city to city. It could be that New York and Montreal differ in this respect. But the places that would normally be very densely occupied, and which would be the natural sort of support for some of your work, have become deserted. It seems that in Montreal, we have all retreated into our neighborhoods, away from central agora-like spaces. So I wonder how the change in the way that we occupy, and Lily, your work, I'm thinking of your work in prisons, which are obviously these very densely populated spaces, access to which I can imagine in a pandemic setting would have been impossible for you. So I wonder how the changes in the way in which cities function as a result of the pandemic has had an effect on the way in which your work, which is in many ways interacts with the agora functions of the city, has been changed.
I think one of the wonderful things that I've seen, you know, not from myself, but from my community of image makers and performers, is having so much more art on the streets, especially in the city. There have been, you know, and obviously this is the queen of this, but there's been a lot more of it. And one of my friends is the artistic director of New York Pops Up, and they're bringing, you know, dozens of performers and performances to the streets of New York. So anybody can, you know, just like walking by can see art. The New York Philharmonic did something similar where they had, you know, a concert on the back of a pickup truck. So, you know, again, anybody just walking by could have access. And I think that's been a wonderful change, making art just available to the public.
And how has the fact that these public spaces are, it could be that New York and Montreal are just very different experiences. Rafael, have you found that it has been more challenging in a context like Montreal, where we have to a large degree abandoned the sort of central spaces of the city, has posed a challenge for the way in which you conceive of your practice?
Yeah, I mean, undoubtedly, we occupy public space with the knowledge that the atmosphere is trying to kill us. And that sets up a very strange dynamic in the body politic. I mean, I think that we look at each other with a certain judgment. I am very judgmental of people who don't wear their mask properly. In fact, I'm very vocal against said people. And just in general, this whole sort of space of being is something that is quite a concern. So I think that changes everything. It changes our understanding of the atmosphere as a neutral space. The place for our song and our voice is also the place that wants to kill us. And the idea that we're living a planetary problem that requires a planetary solution, and that, you know, contrasts with this kind of nationalistic governments that we seem to have sprouting everywhere, is it's a sense of how do you say in English, helplessness, right? Because you understand that this is finally globalization comes here. It affects you, it accepts me. What you want is solidarity. What you want is for people to come together and understand that we're all in this and we have a responsibility and we need to resolve it. But what you get is, you know, people against facts and against science. You get people burning masks. You get people like yesterday here in Montreal, where we had a riot because people don't want a curfew. And so, you know, as somebody who studied sciences, I have very little tolerance for that kind of thing. I think that a lot of these deaths were premature, they were avoidable, and they're basically victims of governments who just want the economy, you know, above all costs. I think Mexico is in fact got a worse ranking in terms of the number of victims of the United States per capita. Canada's not been doing badly. However, right now we are about to take over with more cases than the United States per capita, which I think is incredible, considering the fact that we've done so well for a while. And so, yeah, just observing that and feeling like what I want to see, which is a sense of community solidarity, of understanding that this is a global problem, is actually becoming, sort of a fight for, people's liberties and stuff like that, which does not match the scale of the problem that we have in front of us.
Let me pursue this just a little bit, unless Lily or Jenny want to come in on it. In a way, you've posed the terms of the challenge for artists, especially artists whose work has a public dimension, like yours has very starkly. One of the things that brings us together is public art, and yet bringing us together is something that, perhaps at this stage, there are public health reasons to avoid doing. So I wonder if that has, entered into your calculations of your activities. You were mentioning earlier how great it was to have public events of concerts being sort of delivered publicly, I guess, in the streets of New York City. And at the same time, the message that we're getting is don't get too close to one another. Avoid the spaces, even outdoor spaces that might be, one of the very sort of unfortunate additions to our lexicon is the super spreader event, right? You don't want to be responsible for having created a super spreader event, where that seems to be something that can happen in public space, in outdoor space, as readily as indoors. So to the extent that art is something that's supposed to bring us together, and bringing us together is something that perhaps we want to avoid, has this led you to thinking about perhaps more private ways of having your art be accessed by people? How has the sort of the potential lethal character of the ways in which what you would have expected before to be a sort of positive, bringing people together to experience art communally, changed the way in which you think of your art?
As much as I love public space and screens, of course, one has to be careful not to hurt anybody. This responsibility has had me venture where I probably wouldn't have gone, into Instagram, which gives me pause. But it is a place where not to hurt people, at least with virus. That's been where we've tried to put a combination of warnings and some constructive advice. I would say artists should not hesitate to act like citizens instead of artists. If being a responsible citizen is more likely to literally help things than one's peculiar art practice.
Lily, would you like to add anything?
No.
So I'd like to ask Jenny a specific question to do with what has been a signature feature of the way in which she has acted as an artist over the course of the decades. I introduced you by saying that words were in many ways your material, to use the expression that is famous expression by a philosopher called John Austin. You've taught us how to do things with words that we might not have had any inkling of before. Another unfortunate term that's been added to our lexicon by the pandemic, but perhaps even before, is the idea of an infodemic. People, partly as a result of sitting in front of their screens for as long as they do in the context of the pandemic, are literally bombarded with words. I read somewhere that though books have become a bit of something that the younger generation don't frequent as much, that people are reading more, are actually consuming more words now than they ever have before. The difference being that they are doing it through different media, sitting in front of their screens, their phones, their tablets, what have you. So, and in the context of the pandemic, obviously misinformation has been a huge problem. Part of the words that they have been receiving on their screen have been words that have been pulling them astray, giving them false information about what's going on, misleading information. Have you found the sort of infodemic that people are being subjected to, especially in the context of a pandemic, to be a challenge, to find a place for your words, for the way in which you deliver your words? And perhaps have you been tempted to use other sort of modes of expression in order to sort of escape what seems to be a deluge of words out there that we sometimes have trouble filtering through in order to find the right sources?
Words are still good. I'm sticking with words, especially when they're true. That said, I'm certainly not averse to having them pulse, flash, and do all kinds of tricks to fight disinformation or boredom or loneliness or any number of other or grief, pandemic-related things.
How do you signal? You said that you had been using Instagram, which is, as someone who is a social media novice and who hasn't really gotten beyond Facebook. Instagram is the thing that my 16-year-old daughter uses. How has Instagram felt as a medium, given the uses that it is put to by people which are somewhat different from expressing truths about the social situation in which we find ourselves, warnings about the politics, etc. How has that felt as a medium?
It gives me the creeps a bit, but I don't want to be a complete dinosaur, so I wanted to at least attempt something worthwhile there. The verdict. How
so? You say when you say it gives you the creeps, what are relative to other kinds of media that you've used? What aspects of it give you that sensation?
I'll leave it to it's maybe a cleaner practice to put posters up in the street.
Rafael, I'd like to ask you about the ways in which the pandemic has specifically changed your practice. Your work engages and interacts with the viewers often in a sensory way, in a tactile way, in a way that engages the senses, which is obviously something that is problematic and perhaps even impossible today. How have you adapted your practice to allow for interaction without this kind of physical touch or sensorial touch? And perhaps more generally, how have you allowed the pandemic into your work as a subject matter in the last year or so?
So I prepared a couple of slides, so I'm just going to share my screen so that I can show what we did for that. So the first one is this, which is an artwork where you're invited to go into a sealed hermetic chamber and breathe the air that has already been breathed by everybody before you. This is a work that was going to be exhibited at SF MoMA during the pandemic, but of course, as you can imagine, it got canceled or postponed. You enter this sort of decompression chamber, and the clean air leaves through two valves, and then you're invited into a main cabin to share the viruses, bacteria, pheromones, and any kind of airborne pollutants in the room and breathe this stale, vicious air. There's massive warnings not to do this. Warnings for panic because you need to go through the decompression chamber, for contagion because there are no filters in the system, and finally for asphyxiation because there's only 10 days of oxygen and we let people go in for 10 minutes only. The piece collects the breath of all of the people and then sends it through this system of bellows, which activate these valves, and then 61 brown paper bags inflate and deflate more or less 10,000 times a day, which is the normal respiratory frequency for an adult at rest. The piece is meant to be a way to make tangible this commons, the water we drink, the air we breathe, the land we're on, and then create a toxic environment where your participation actually makes it worse for future participants. Oftentimes when we're making seductive experiences for the public, we pretend that participation is something positive, something that will empower you. In this piece, if you participate too long, you die. And it's a very disgusting artwork. I would never go inside of it. I mean, I would if I'm the first person, but after that, I would never go in. But we've presented it now in 3 continents and people line up to try it. I don't know when, if ever, we'll be able to present that again. So in thinking about how do we deal with social distancing, we designed a website, basically. It's called The Crack in the Hourglass, where we invite people from anywhere in the world to send a portrait of their loved one. So we're looking to create a temporary memorial for people who have passed because of COVID. So friends and family members send a photo of their loved one, and then a robot arm basically drops hourglass sand to draw the portrait of the loved one. And then this takes about 20 minutes to make. And the website invites you and your friends to go and visit the building of this particular drawing. And then once it's been presented, it makes a web page for every participant. And crucially, the drawings are made on a platform, a robotic platform, which tilts slowly so that the sand is recovered at the end of it. So you'll see it now. The sand is starting to get pulled, and then it goes back into a small container, and then it gets recycled to draw more and more portraits. So the idea is, this is like a typical web page for the project. The idea is to have a way to have closure, to be able to mourn. So I've always thought that art is a really good mechanism to mourn, to bring people together, even if you couldn't physically. The lack of funerals, the lack of rites, of ceremonies, of someone's dying is a real tragedy as well, because you hear this all the time. Somebody's father went into the hospital with a cough and then you never saw him again. The body was toxic. You couldn't be there in a funeral. So are there ways that we can create experiences, remote experiences, where people can personalize and come to terms with COVID? We have so far over 300 of those portraits, and I invite, if anybody is here been affected by COVID. We have the youngest person is the 15-year-old, and then we have all the way up to 102-year-old. And so for each one of these people, you will see the webpage made. And the robot itself is basically a very simple machine, but the idea of using Balotelli, the hourglass sand, to do the drawing, is a way to create an event that happens live online, that people can come together to visit and mourn. Because I think as important as the statistics, like the problem we have with COVID is the statistics are brutal, right? We have millions of people dead, and it's very difficult, very abstract to put a face on these statistics, to tell a story behind them. So this project tries to do that, is how do you materialize, even if it's ephemerally, the presence, the unique premature death of somebody who should not have died. And then equally important is a sense of continuity, because all the hundreds of portraits are made from the very same hourglass sand, which we recover with each drawing. So this is the project that we did to try and contribute, or to just have that sense of how can online bring us together to experience something that helps us understand this loss. So
Rafael, I can't resist asking you. There's something very arresting about the sudden disappearance of the image. It's slowly constructed, and then I guess the mechanism is swiveled, and the sand falls away, and the image disappears. Do you have a sense? Do you communicate with the people who have signed up for this project after the fact to see how they have reacted to it? There's an intention on your part, which you stated very clearly, to be of helping people achieve closure and helping them mourn. Is that something that is that what is reported to you by people who have who have volunteered to go through this with an image of one of their loved ones.
Yeah, I mean, that has happened. I mean, mostly it's families who are sending a family member over, and they see this as an opportunity to get together. It's true that the disappearance is violent, but so is death, right? So you must give the gravitas of the situation. The disappearance is what actually is effective in being able to come to terms with the termination of a life. Montaigne used to say that to philosophize is to learn how to die. I think that that's the same with art. You know, we're all just trying to come to terms with the fact that this is a finite period that we get. But when you're dealing with premature deaths, like all of these are, you haven't had that time to age and to understand what actually is about to happen. And so these projects are on purpose ephemeral, because they're not trying to be a replacement. They're trying to be a ritual. In Mexico, we have very robust rituals of how to deal with death, and I find that it's a genuine concern. There's people who have not been able to mourn, and I have a quote here by philosopher Achille Mbembe, which I'd like to just share real quick, about what happens to a civilization that doesn't mourn. So I don't know if you guys can read that. It's basically saying that the death of community, that unmediated farewells will be few and far between. The death of community, no community worthy of its name in which saying one's last farewell, that is remembering the living at the moment of death, becomes possible. So I think that's the kind of situation that we're stuck in as a society, not really knowing how to calculate or express that loss. And art can be useful sometimes for that kind of thing, whether it's successful or not. You know, it's I wanted to do something that would reflect my feeling that art could help more.
Before I move to Lily, I'd like to remind people who may not have been here when I did the introduction that we're going to try to keep a few minutes aside for questions from people who are out there. If you do have questions, please place them in the Q&A. If you're watching this in French, it's Q&R, questions et réponses, at the bottom of your screen. Lily, if I may turn to you now, your work documents and bears witness to people's lived experiences in often very dense institutional settings. Your book, your recently published book, which I mentioned in your introduction, is a work on prisons, portraits of people in prisons. Those spaces now are regulated to the point where it would be unimaginable for an enterprise like the one that you engaged in to produce that book to be carried out. And one wonders whether those kinds of public spaces that have been the object of your work will be returned to us in the way that they were before the pandemic. How do you respond? How do you adapt, both now and as you look forward to the sort of modified situation that we'll find ourselves when we move out of the acute phase of the crisis into what will probably be a situation of risk that is not entirely disappeared, moderate risk as opposed to the acute risk that faces us now. An open-ended question to ask you to reflect on the public nature of your work.
I mentioned a little bit in the beginning that, you know, for the first time in my life, my work started to look from within more. And that, you know, I was even photographing how, you know, the light fell on my bed in the morning, which sounds kind of stupid, but, you know, when you've been locked down for this long in this space, you know, you start to notice beautiful things, you know, little things around your life. So that's been a positive. As to the work I did in jail, I was actually asked, I won't say what publication, but a major publication in May of last year, or April even, to go into a jail and to do a story. And I said no.
In the context of the pandemic? Well,
yes. Just because it was too risky for me, for my family, for other people, you know, it just was. There's a point when doing work, even if it's important work, is not worth it if it is going to put anybody at risk. So, I mean, that's a pretty clear, obvious, ethical and practical line. So, you know, when I was working on this project in Cook County Jail in Chicago, it became clear to me that there's so many systemic issues in this country that are not addressed and so directly lead to incarceration. Poverty, bad policy, lack of opportunity, racism. I mean, they're obviously very much in the forefront in America right now. Lack of healthcare, lack of mental health care. And these are all things, that directly lead to people being in jail from just interviewing people and getting their histories. Ever since I did this book, I've wanted to do even longer term projects, working with people who are no longer incarcerated or before they are. And I'm actually starting a project now working with a nonprofit, hopefully just with women who are experiencing racism, poverty, sexism, all of these issues, and how they are working to stay out of jail or are reintegrating into society, because all of these issues are so connected, obviously. And I also still don't want to go into like a big institutional setting. So, I'm interviewing people outside from a safe distance. I'm, photographing outside. I'm just making practical shifts. And it's been a push to do a project that I've wanted to do for a long time. Yeah.
We're moving close to the time that I wanted to keep aside for questions from people who are out there listening to us, and there are already a couple that have come in. Perhaps I'd add my questions by asking you to look forward. One of the hypotheses that I've been operating under, both in my own life and in thinking about the future of all these institutions, be they educational institutions such as the one that I work in, cultural institutions, community organizations, is that as much as we would like to think that we're moving into a situation where when we all get vaccinated, we will be back to the same level of risk that we were at before the pandemic began, which, by the way, is not a zero risk situation. I think that Rafael's installation, the one that he had to shut down, shows very clearly that even before COVID, we were to some degree risks to one another, just in virtue of breathing in the same spaces. But I think it's fair to say that at least for a while, we will be living in environments that where moderate risk rather than acute risks is our situation. There are things that are probably be inconceivable, either because they will be regulated or because people's own risk tolerance levels will make it the case that things that they did before they won't be able to imagine doing again. Crowding into very tightly packed gallery spaces, going to concerts, massing together perhaps in public venues, either outside or inside. As you look into your crystal balls, to the extent that you have them, how do you see the changed perception of risk that we will find ourselves in for years to come affecting the way in which you both think about the themes perhaps that are central to your art, but also the ways in which to present them? Rafael, perhaps I'll go to you. You described that chamber, which it's actually kind of amazing in that it foreshadows the way in which we think about the risk of breathing in the presence of others. I couldn't imagine this being allowed in post-COVID conditions anywhere in the world, and I probably couldn't imagine anyone thinking that it was something that they might want to do in the way that, perhaps surprisingly to some of us, they did flock to do it in the past. So just reflections on the future.
Yeah, so I mean, I think that we're getting interested in the idea that things are not neutral, right? Phenomena such as the air that is inside of you, which is private, becomes public and now is breathed by somebody else. I think that we have to think of the interrelationship of all of these parts. We're living in a reality called globalization, and the problems that we have fit that. So I constantly keep thinking, when I made that project, Vicious Circular Breathing, was more about the planetary biospheric collapse that we are experiencing. So it was about, do you remember that time when the CEO of Nestle said that water was not a fundamental human right. And he was saying this because he was bottling San Pellegrino and Evian and all the other bottles. And so the notion is, well, who has access, who has ownership over this clean air? How do we value it? And more importantly, how do we make evident the fact that the toxicity that we have right now, I think yesterday we got 422 parts per million of carbon dioxide. Never in the history of humankind have we ever breathed that amount of carbon dioxide. So for me, as I think about the future, what I'm hoping is that some of the terminology that we've used to create solidarity around COVID, things like flattening the curve, can become the lingo that we can then use for something like climate change. Because the extinction event is here. Every 3 minutes, a new species becomes extinct. And as a dad of 3 kids, I want to make sure that the planet, can exist for them and not just sort of get lost with imagination of imaginary Mars colonies or something like that. So the idea for me is, how do we tie COVID to what 350.org calls a just recovery? How do we come back not to normal, but to a conscience that, as Buckminster Fuller used to say, planetary problems need planetary solutions. How do we approach such daunting tasks? And right now, the solutions that we have, which is letting a market run untested and unbalanced, is actually, raping the planet. How do we address that? And I think that as an artist, more and more, I'm interested, and I think the people that I follow are interested in, how do we make a contribution against this decimation of our habitat? I would think that COVID is related to that, and hopefully it can give us a step toward this just recovery.
Let me echo Lily's do no harm, use common sense to do no harm, and to look forward constructively. I would say it's worthwhile to look back at what permitted Trump and posse to, in effect, commit mass murder with his lack of handling COVID. Let's not do that again.
Right, absolutely. Nationalism seems not to be the solution. Again and again, populism and nationalism is not the solution when you're confronted with problems like these.
So if it's okay with you, I'm going to go to some questions that have been posed by some people in the chat. Carol Weil asks, I wonder whether COVID has opened up new spaces and made the public more accessible to artists who might have previously had greater difficulties in gaining public attention. Has the disruption had positive impacts? For example, Igor Levit, the Russian-German pianist, who has received much greater renown because of his live streaming of house concerts. So are there positives in the way in which COVID has perhaps opened up new spaces, increased accessibility, that we should try to avoid losing as we find our way out of the present sort of acute phase of the crisis?
People going to NFTs is interesting, not necessarily environmentally, but it's a way for people who didn't have access to galleries and museums perhaps to show their work and to agitate properly.
But if Beeple is what's happened, then I'm getting off. I mean, I can't take the level of a lot of the NFT hysteria, because it's all about like the transactional cost. And I'm still to see critical uses of that technology. I'm not saying they're not there. I'm just saying I'm not privy to which ones those are. I think that it's just such a monetary exchange. It feels like a pyramid. I am encouraged. I mean, I find it hard to be encouraged by NFTs. You mentioned it, Jenny, environmentally, right? This is just speaking about the decimation of the planet and understanding that it's powered by a blockchain that is decidedly an arms race to more and more calculation and more environmental usage makes it a sad platform for me to consider at this time. I'm interested in it, but I find it difficult to be optimistic about what has happened during the pandemic. So many sites, so many artist-run places have closed, have shuttered. Lives of so many artists living in precarity have been really challenged, and so I can't see the positive in how this has created spaces for artists. Anyway, sorry.
I've seen it in New York. I mentioned this a little before, but you know, the New York Phil, which is one of the elite spaces in New York City, right? You know, it's a very specific audience that goes there, was forced to bring music outside, and especially targeting neighborhoods that, you know, generally the population is not going to the New York Philharmonic. And I think that was a beautiful and special thing that would not have happened otherwise. And at least they say that that's something that they will continue, and that they will bring music out into communities. I'm sure there are many other examples, but so one teeny one too.
Yeah.
One of our much beloved Montreal singer-songwriters, Martha Wainwright, at the beginning of the pandemic, when it was still quite cold here in Montreal, took to going up on the roof of her concert venue and live streaming from the roof, which became a lifeline, I think, for a lot of people on a weekly basis through the summer, even if it was only for 15 or 20 minutes at a time, singing 2 or 3 songs, often songs of Leonard Cohen's, which for many of us have had deep resonance over the course of the pandemic. I'm going to go back. We still have a few minutes. Gabriella is going to tell me when I have to close us down. Ken McLaughlin asks a question. After 30 years of doing photography, I started writing a novel, but only outdoors. It's been quite liberating somehow to do something almost completely different. Have any of you experienced such a change? I've been asking my questions in a way that presupposes sort of continuity between what you're doing now, what you see yourself doing in the future, and what you've done in the past. But has there been the temptation to use the pandemic and the constraints that it imposes as a way of doing something completely different?
I'm making tremendously bad drippy watercolors on the Mueller report. I'm sure the Mueller report is going to function any day now as a result.
And what was the thought process or the process of feeling that got you into going from words that you yourself, as it were, produced to dripping paint on words?
I think some quality time with mortality is good for artists and art making. Before I kick, I thought using my hands could be an experiment at least.
And how is the product of your dripping onto the Mueller report going to be shared with the public? Is it available on your website?
You'll see, but it will be back to a sneaky street practicey kind of junk.
We have a question from Gabriella Krantz, actually, which I'd like to ask all of you. How does your identity as a parent influence your identity as an artist in the context of the pandemic? And has it changed in this context where we're made aware of our family ties and of their fragility?
I'll take that one.
Nah. Behold, the exhibit.
Rafael, you have your hand raised.
Yeah.
That means you go.
I don't. Do I?
Yeah.
No, you just secreted it. That's fatal.
I'm Latino. I'm always raising them.
Oh God. Having a newborn in that moment was one of the most terrifying moments of my life. You know, you're so scared and feeling vulnerable and worried anyway, and having that on top of it, you know, it's not something I wish on anyone. And you know, we moved upstate and we've been staying with my family, so that has been a positive. You know, we had a melded family, which has certainly brought its insanity. but I think it's generally good.
We're in the same house now.
Perhaps, Rafael, did you want to come in on that question? Whether you had your hand up?
I've used some of my time to kind of impose my tastes on my kids. So I made them watch Tanarjuat, which is the best Canadian film ever, The Long Runner. I've made them watch Kaurismäki and Kusturica, and I've made them watch like just stuff that I like that I wanted to impose. This was my chance. You know, it would be impossible if they were out and about. So I have them. I captured them. They've started listening to the music I like and so on. So it's just imposing micro impositions on your kids to you know, impose your biases.
I'm going to use a question of Anne Elborns to close us out. I'm going to adapt it a little bit and ask each one of you perhaps to conclude your thoughts by asking you, when people look at your art 100 years from now, what will they be able to see about the pandemic through the art that you've created in it that perhaps they wouldn't have been able to see in any other way, if anything?
I might have to resort to carving in stone.
I think that at least, especially because I'm so honored to be here in this talk. I mean, Jenny's, your work has always created this idea of the artwork as a certain campaign, as a certain body of thought, as a way to act. And so I would love it if when people look back at this time, they would look at work such as Jenny Holtzer's to sort of understand that the artists were aware of the gravity of the situation, and they were not just decorating rich people's homes, but that they were actually taking it to the streets. They were trying to make a change, and that we failed miserably, but we tried. And that would be, you know, well, hopefully we don't fail, but most likely we will. I would just love it if people consider this kind of more active work a representation of the past, you know, number of decades.
I will reveal myself to have lied and can't resist, given the fact that Rafael has pointed to the active in the streets aspect of the artist in a crisis such as the pandemic, to ask Jenny Sofia Messa's question, which is, Jenny, what's your advice for not getting seen whilst working in the streets?
Dark clothing.
There you go. There's your... and working under the cover of night?
And a mask, late at night. I was only pulled into a police car once. So sneakiness relative to street practice is good, not so hot in politics.
Well, I'd like to, we've arrived at the end of our discussion. So I'd like to thank all three of you for your generosity in sharing your reflections with us, Lily Kogelski, Jenny Holtzer, Rafael Lozano-Hemmer. I'd like to remind everybody that if you registered, you will be receiving an email which will give you information regarding the recording of the webinar, and there may perhaps be some special additions that we include with the recording of the webinar. There will also be information about the next one of these webinars that will have to do with cultural entrepreneurs, the people who have had to try to figure out how to keep the performing arts alive, dance, theater, music. That will be happening on May 6th. I hope that many of you who have joined us today will be able to join us then. And it only remains for me to wish all of you a wonderful afternoon. And again, thank you very much to our three guests. Bye-bye.
Bye, y'all.